Hello and welcome. Settle in and make yourself comfortable. We're about to begin a long and peaceful journey together, drifting back through time to a world of castles, crowns, and kings. Our destination is France, a land whose history is deeply intertwined with the story of its monarchy, a dynasty that shaped not only a nation, but the very course of Europe itself. We'll be traveling from the twilight of the Roman Empire, through the mists of the early Middle Ages, to south all the way to the dramatic revolutions that brought an end to an era. This is a story of power, piety, and politics, of remarkable achievements and profound tragedies. We'll meet charismatic rulers and quiet figures who changed history. Our journey is a long one, but there is no hurry. You are safe here, and you can simply let the sound of my voice guide you, carrying you gently through the centuries. Imagine for a moment the land we now know as France. It is not yet a unified kingdom. Instead, it is a patchwork of territories, a landscape of rolling hills, dense forests, and winding rivers. The last echoes of Roman authority are fading, replaced by the rise of new, powerful Germanic tribes. The Franks, a confederation of these tribes, are becoming the dominant force. Their leader, a man named Clovis, is the first to truly unite these disparate peoples under a single crown. He is a pivotal figure, a king who converts to Christianity in a move that binds the monarchy forever to the church, establishing a foundation that will last for over 1,000 years. His dynasty, the Merovingians, are the first chapter of our story. We'll explore their unique culture, their long-haired kings, and the eventual decay of their power as the do-nothing kings lose their authority to their chief ministers, the mayors of the palace. The transition to the next great dynasty is a story of ambition and religious sanction. It is here we meet the formidable figure of Charlemagne, a king so powerful and so visionary that he is crowned Emperor of the Romans. His reign marks a high point, a brief but brilliant period of intellectual and cultural rebirth known as the Carolingian Renaissance. We'll witness his immense empire stretch across a vast swath of Europe, a testament to his military genius and political foresight. Yet, empires are often fragile, and we'll see how Charlemagne's legacy begins to fracture after his death, his vast realm divided among his grandsons. This division lays the groundwork for the modern nations of France and Germany, and we'll watch as the Carolingian line slowly loses its grip, paving the way for a new family to take the throne. The House of Capet rises from the ashes of Carolingian decline. This is where the story of the French monarchy truly begins to take its modern form. Hugh Pitt, the first king of this new line, is a quiet but cunning ruler. His dynasty, unlike those before, is built on longevity and stability. For over 3 centuries, son follows father in unbroken succession. We'll see how these early Capetians, starting with a small royal domain around Paris, gradually expand their power, consolidating a true kingdom. They are the builders of a nation. We'll see the early stirrings of the great cathedrals, the growth of towns, and the slow, deliberate centralization of power away from the great feudal lords. The French monarchy becomes a powerful force, a symbol of national unity. As we continue, we'll move into the High Middle Ages, a time of great conflict and profound change. The Valois dynasty will take the throne, inheriting a kingdom on the brink of disaster. We'll explore the devastating 100 Years' War with England, a conflict that tests the very survival of the French kingdom. We'll meet iconic figures like Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who inspires a nation and turns the tide of the war. We'll also witness the French Renaissance, a period of artistic and intellectual flourishing, as new ideas and new forms of beauty arrive from Italy. This is a time of both great beauty and brutal religious strife, as the Reformation shatters the religious unity of Europe. The French wars of religion will tear the kingdom apart, pitting Catholics against Protestants in a series of bloody conflicts. Our journey then leads us to the pinnacle of royal power and the age of absolute monarchy. The Bourbon dynasty takes the throne, and we will follow their rise to unimaginable authority. We'll witness the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, a monarch who builds the magnificent Palace of Versailles and places France at the center of the European stage. His court is a masterpiece of ceremony and spectacle, a world of intricate etiquette and dazzling art. But beneath the gilded surface, we will sense a growing unease. The costs of constant war and the lavish lifestyle of the court begin to strain the kingdom's resources. We'll see how the Enlightenment, with its new ideas of liberty and reason, begins to challenge the very foundation of royal authority. The final chapters of our story are filled with drama and revolution. We will witness the decline of the monarchy under the weight of debt and popular discontent. The reign of Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette is a time of both innocence and immense misjudgment. Their story is one of a royal family caught in the swirling vortex of historical forces far beyond their control. We'll hear the rising chorus of discontent and feel the tension build until the storm breaks. The French Revolution erupts, and in its wake, the old world is swept away. We will bear witness to the end of a 1,000-year-old tradition, the fall of a dynasty, and the birth of a new political order. The monarchy will be abolished, but its legacy will linger, a deep and powerful current in the history of France and the world. So let us begin our peaceful descent into history. Close your eyes if you wish. Relax your body and mind. The past awaits us, a vast and quiet landscape ready to be explored. Let's start at the very beginning, with the kings of the Franks, the founders of a nation. The journey through the mists of time begins with the Franks, a powerful Germanic confederation whose name would one day be synonymous with France itself. Their lands were a patchwork of territories, a vast and wild landscape that stretched from the Rhine River westward. In the late 5th century, a young warrior chieftain named Clovis inherited the leadership of one of these tribes, the Salian Franks. He was not yet a king in the modern sense, but a leader whose authority was based on military prowess and loyalty. Clovis proved to be a master of both. He was a ruthless and brilliant military commander who systematically expanded his domain, defeating the last vestiges of Roman power in Gaul and conquering rival Frankish kingdoms. His ambition was not just for land, but for legacy. The most pivotal moment in Clovis's reign, and perhaps in the entire early history of the French monarchy, came with his conversion to Christianity. Most of the Germanic tribes who had swept across Europe were followers of Arianism, a form of Christianity considered heretical by the Catholic Church. Clovis, however, chose the Catholic path. The story, a legend woven with historical truth, recounts how he prayed for victory against the Alemanni tribe and promised to convert if he won. He did, and on Christmas Day, around the year 496, he was baptized by Saint Remigius in the Cathedral of Reims. This single act had profound consequences. It allied the Frankish monarchy with the immense power and influence of the Roman Catholic Church, a bond that would endure for over 1,000 years. It gave the kings of the Franks a divine sanction, transforming them from mere tribal leaders into consecrated monarchs. With Clovis, the Merovingian dynasty was born, named after his semi-mythical ancestor, Merovech. The Merovingian kings were known for their long hair, a symbol of their power and sacred status. They ruled over a kingdom that was still very much a personal possession, divided among the king's sons upon his death. This practice, known as partible inheritance, was a constant source of instability and civil war. For a time, strong kings like Dagobert managed to hold the realm together, but over time, the Merovingian line grew weaker. The kings became known as the rois fainéants, or do-nothing kings, their authority fading into obscurity. They were content with the ceremonial trappings of power, while the real governance of the kingdom was seized by the mayors of the palace, the chief officers of the royal household. This is where the second great dynasty of early French history begins. The mayors of the palace, members of the Pipinid family, gradually consolidated their power, eclipsing the Merovingian kings altogether. One of the most famous of these mayors was Charles Martel, the Hammer, a formidable warrior who, in the year 732, led the Franks to a decisive victory over a Muslim army at the Battle of Tours. This victory not only halted the Islamic expansion into Western Europe, but also cemented the Pipinids as the true power behind the throne. His son, Pepin the Short, was even more ambitious. He sought not just the power of a king, but the title itself. In a shrewd political move, he appealed to the Pope, asking, "Who should be king? He who has the name or he who has the power?" With the Pope's blessing, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king and was anointed with holy oil in 751, a ceremony that underscored the religious authority of his new dynasty, the Carolingians. Pepin's son was Charlemagne, a name that literally means Charles the Great. His reign is the dazzling high point of this early period. Charlemagne was a colossal figure, a man of immense physical stature and intellectual curiosity. He was a tireless military commander who campaigned almost every year, expanding his kingdom to include what is now France, Germany, and Italy. He crushed the Lombards, battled the Saxons, and established a vast new empire. On Christmas Day 800, while praying in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. This coronation was a moment of profound symbolism. It revived the idea of a unified Roman Empire in the West and solidified the link between the papacy and the new Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne's court at Aachen became a center of learning and culture, a brief but brilliant flowering known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He promoted education, standardized writing, and sponsored a revival of classical scholarship. His legacy was not just military or political, but also cultural. He created a sense of a shared European identity, one rooted in Christianity and Latin learning. However, the empire was a personal achievement, held together by his force of will. Upon his death, it was divided among his grandsons by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This treaty created three distinct kingdoms, one of which, West Francia, would eventually become France. The Carolingian line, like the Merovingian before it, grew weaker over time, its power eroded by Viking invasions and the rising authority of the great feudal lords. The stage was now set for the next and most enduring dynasty to emerge. The slow decline of the Carolingians created the perfect vacuum for a new family to claim the throne and lay the foundations for a truly centralized French state. As the 9th and 10th centuries unfolded, the great empire of Charlemagne continued to fragment. The Carolingian kings, weakened by internal strife and the relentless incursions of Viking raiders, saw their authority wane. The once mighty crown was becoming a symbol of a power that no longer existed in reality. The true authority lay with the powerful feudal lords, the Dukes of Normandy, the Counts of Anjou, and the Dukes of Burgundy, who ruled their lands with a near-sovereign independence. The king, whose domain had shrunk to a small territory around Paris and Orléans, was little more than a first among equals. The stage was set for a new dynasty, one that would rise not through sheer military might, but through a combination of clever politics, religious sanction, and a remarkable knack for longevity. The year 987 marks a quiet but monumental turning point. The last of the Carolingian line died without a direct male heir. The great nobles of the realm gathered to elect a new king. Their choice fell upon a man named Hugh Capet, the Count of Paris. He was not the most powerful lord, but he was a strategic and acceptable compromise. He came from a family of Carolingian officials who had risen to prominence through their defense of Paris against Viking sieges. With his anointing by the Archbishop of Reims, the Capetian dynasty was born, a royal line that would rule France for over 3 centuries in direct succession, and whose cadet branches would reign for another 5. The early Capetian kings were not the all-powerful monarchs of later centuries. Their royal domain, the Ile-de-France, was a small territory at the heart of the kingdom. It was a landscape of gentle rivers, fertile fields, and dense forests, with the city of Paris at its center, surrounded by the lands of powerful, often rebellious vassals. Their challenge was immense, to transform a nominal title into a real authority. They accomplished this not with grand wars of conquest, but with patience and political astuteness. One of their most brilliant strategies was the practice of rex designatus, or designated king. To avoid the risk of a contested succession, each king would have his eldest son crowned and anointed as co-ruler in his own lifetime. This practice, used for over a century, ensured a smooth and unbroken transfer of power from father to son, a dynastic stability unheard of in medieval Europe. As we drift through these early centuries, we see the slow, deliberate work of nation building. The reigns of kings like Louis VI, nicknamed the Fat, show a monarch less concerned with grand empire building and more with the nitty-gritty of consolidating power within his own small domain. Louis VI was a warrior king in miniature, constantly battling the recalcitrant minor lords in his immediate vicinity, who built castles to defy his authority. He was a tireless defender of the crown's rights, a figure of surprising energy for his portly frame, and his persistent efforts laid the groundwork for future expansion. His son, Louis VII, inherited a more secure kingdom and a more complex set of challenges. His reign saw the beginning of a long and defining rivalry with England. His ill-fated marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the powerful and charismatic Duchess of the vast southern territories, ended in divorce. Eleanor soon married Henry Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, who would become King Henry II of England. This union created the Angevin Empire, a vast and formidable entity that held more land in France than the French king himself. The stage was set for centuries of conflict between the two monarchies, a struggle for control over the very soul of France. But even as the Capetian kings faced these external pressures, the kingdom itself was changing. This was the era of the great cathedral builders. In places like Saint-Denis, near Paris, the abbot Suger began to rebuild his abbey church in a revolutionary new style. He used pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and immense stained glass windows to create a sense of light and space that seemed to reach toward the heavens. This was the dawn of Gothic architecture, a style that perfectly reflected the new confidence and piety of the age. These towering structures, with their soaring spires and intricate carvings, were not just houses of worship. They were symbols of royal and civic pride, testaments to a growing national identity. This period also saw the rise of towns and universities. As feudalism began to recede, urban centers like Paris grew, becoming hubs of commerce and intellectual life. The University of Paris became a beacon of scholarship, attracting students from across Europe to its bustling streets. The French monarchy, seeing the value of a centralized administration, began to develop a bureaucratic system, employing trained legal scholars to manage the affairs of the state. It was a slow and painstaking process, but the king's reach was gradually extending beyond his domain, a delicate web of influence and authority slowly spreading across the kingdom. The legacy of these early Capetians is not one of dramatic battles or grand pronouncements. It is a story of quiet persistence and deep-seated faith. They created a monarchy that was seen as divinely sanctioned, a symbol of stability and continuity in a turbulent world. By patiently expanding their power, protecting their succession, and allying with the church and the growing urban centers, they transformed the French crown from a symbolic bauble into a powerful institution. We can imagine them, walking through the courtyards of their modest palaces, looking out at a kingdom that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming a true nation. It is this foundation, built brick by brick over centuries, that would support the great and complex history yet to come. As the 12th century began to draw close, the Capetian dynasty had quietly laid a solid foundation for its power. The stage was set for the arrival of a truly transformative figure, a king who would take the modest royal domain and forge it into the heart of a great kingdom. His name was Philip II, though history remembers him best as Philip Augustus, the one who would august or increase the territory and prestige of the French monarchy. When he came to the throne in 1180, he faced the immense challenge of the Angevin Empire, a vast collection of lands in France controlled by the English king, Henry II. This empire was a constant threat, and Philip's life's work was to dismantle it. Philip Augustus was a cunning and patient king, a master of political maneuvering. He used the internal conflicts within the Angevin family to his advantage, pitting Henry's sons against their father and against each other. When Henry II died, Philip continued his strategic pressure on Henry's successor, Richard the Lionheart, a man famous for his chivalry, but who spent much of his reign on crusade. It was with Richard's younger brother, King John, that Philip's true genius became apparent. Philip took advantage of John's poor reputation and military blunders. When John failed to appear in the French court to answer charges as Philip's vassal, Philip declared all of John's French lands forfeit. In a series of brilliant campaigns from 1202 to 1204, Philip Augustus seized the key territories of Normandy, Anjou, and Touraine. This was a monumental victory. The royal domain quadrupled in size, and the balance of power in Western Europe was forever shifted. The kings of France were now indisputably the most powerful rulers in their own realm. With the consolidation of his new territories, Philip Augustus turned his attention to Paris. He transformed the city from a bustling medieval town into a true royal capital. He had the city's main streets paved, built a fortified wall to protect it, and began the construction of a new royal palace, the Louvre, as a fortress to hold his archives and treasures. He was a king who understood the power of a strong, centralized state, creating a new class of royal officials, called bailli and seneschal, to administer his lands and collect taxes. He was the great administrator who gave the kingdom a new sense of order and national purpose. Philip's legacy was built upon by his grandson, Louis X, a figure so revered that he would be canonized as a saint. Saint Louis, as he is known, was not a conqueror, but a reformer and a paragon of piety. His reign, from 1226 to 1270, is often seen as the golden age of the Capetian monarchy. He believed that a king's duty was to be a shepherd to his people, ensuring justice and peace. He established a system of royal courts known as the parliaments, where anyone, regardless of status, could appeal for justice. He held court under a great oak tree at Vincennes, where he listened to the petitions of his subjects personally. He issued a series of ordinances aimed at improving the lives of his people and cracking down on the abuses of his officials. St. Louis's faith was the driving force behind his reign. He was a devout Catholic who led 2 crusades to the Holy Land. Though both were military failures, they earned him immense prestige and cemented his image as a truly Christian king. His most lasting monument to his faith and his reign is the stunning Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, a jewel box of Gothic architecture built to house relics of the Passion, including the crown of thorns. We can still imagine the quiet light of the sun streaming through its magnificent stained glass windows, each panel telling a biblical story, a visual testament to the king's deep piety. The end of the direct Capetian line came with Louis X's grandson, Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, because of his handsome looks. Philip IV was a king of an entirely new era, a brilliant but ruthless pragmatist. He was a master of finance and law, and he expanded the power of the monarchy in a way that his predecessors had only dreamed of. His reign is famous for his audacious confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII over the right to tax the clergy. Philip's victory in this struggle asserted the supremacy of the French crown over the church within his own kingdom, a revolutionary idea for the time. He also famously dissolved the powerful and wealthy Knights Templar, a crusading order that had become a banking powerhouse. In 1307, he had the Templars arrested and their property seized, a bold move that filled the royal treasury and eliminated a powerful rival. Yet, despite his immense power, Philip the Fair's legacy was a tragic one. His 3 sons each reigned in quick succession and died without male heirs, a period known as the Cursed Kings. The death of the last of them, Charles IV, in 1328, brought the direct Capetian line to an end after more than 300 years of unbroken succession. The question of who would inherit the throne plunged the kingdom into a dynastic crisis. The crown passed to a cousin, Philip of Valois, but his claim was contested by the English king, Edward III, who claimed the throne through his mother, Philip the Fair's daughter. This unresolved succession dispute, coupled with deep-seated tensions over control of French territories, would ignite a conflict that would define the next century, the 100 Years' War. The quiet, persistent work of the early Capetians had created a powerful kingdom, but its very strength now made it a prize worth fighting for. A prize that would be contested in a long and devastating conflict that would test the very soul of the French nation. The year 1328 marked the end of an era. The direct line of the Capetian dynasty, a succession that had endured for over 300 years, had died out. The crown passed to Philip VI, a cousin from the House of Valois, a cadet branch of the Capetian family. But the throne was not his alone. Across the English Channel, a new contender emerged, King Edward III of England, whose mother was the daughter of the late French king, Philip the Fair. In an age when dynastic claims were paramount, Edward's lineage gave him a powerful, if ultimately untenable, claim to the French throne. This dynastic dispute, combined with long-standing territorial rivalries over the rich region of Flanders and the Duchy of Aquitaine, ignited a long and devastating conflict that would come to be known as the 100 Years' War. The early years of the war were a string of calamities for France. The English, with their disciplined longbowmen, proved devastatingly effective against the heavily armored French knights. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the French army suffered a crushing defeat, and the English went on to seize the key port of Calais. A decade later, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the French army was again routed, and the French king himself, John VI, was captured and taken prisoner to London. The French monarchy, for the first time in centuries, seemed on the brink of collapse. The kingdom was plunged into chaos, with rebellious peasants rising up in the countryside and ambitious nobles vying for power. As if the war were not enough, another catastrophe swept through France. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death arrived on the continent, a terrifying pandemic that would wipe out as much as a third of the population. The plague did not discriminate between peasant and noble, between town and countryside. It left behind deserted villages, economic collapse, and a profound sense of despair. The French state, already weakened by military defeat, struggled to respond. The crisis seemed insurmountable. Yet, it was from this moment of profound darkness that a new sense of French national identity began to emerge. The suffering of the war and the plague brought a shared experience of hardship that transcended feudal loyalties. The turning point of the war arrived with the ascension of Charles VII, a king whose early reign was marked by profound weakness and self-doubt. The English had seized control of the northern half of France, and their allies, the powerful Dukes of Burgundy, controlled much of the east. The French court was in disarray, and the English were laying siege to the last major city in loyal France, Orléans. The mood was one of utter defeat. It was at this moment that a miracle seemed to occur. In a small village on the border of a war-torn France, a young peasant girl named Joan of Arc began to hear voices. She claimed that these voices, sent by God, instructed her to lead the French army and have the Dauphin, Charles, crowned king at Reims Cathedral, the traditional site of French coronations, which was deep in enemy territory. Against all reason, the desperate court of Charles VII agreed to meet with her. Her profound faith and unwavering determination were infectious. Dressed in armor and carrying a banner, she was sent to Orléans. Her arrival in 1429 revitalized the French troops, and within days, the English siege was broken. The Maid of Orleans became a national hero, a symbol of hope and divine favor. She then convinced the Dauphin to undertake the perilous journey to Reims. The coronation of Charles VII in a reclaimed city, with Joan by his side, was a moment of immense psychological and political importance. It legitimized his reign and gave the French people a king to rally behind. Though Joan was later captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, who had her burned at the stake as a heretic, her sacrifice had already turned the tide. With a newfound confidence and the support of a united kingdom, Charles VI began the slow, painstaking process of reclaiming his kingdom. He established France's first permanent professional army, freeing the monarchy from its dependence on the unreliable feudal levies. He reformed the state's finances and administrative systems, building on the foundations laid by the early Capetians. The French slowly pushed the English out, and by 1453, the Hundred Years' War was over. The English held only Calais, and France, though scarred by the century-long conflict, emerged a unified and truly sovereign nation. The end of the war ushered in a new era of royal power and cultural vibrancy. The Valois kings, having survived the crucible of the war, now ruled a powerful and centralized state. In the early 16th century, Francis I brought the Italian Renaissance to France. He was a great patron of the arts, inviting artists and scholars to his court. He famously lured Leonardo da Vinci to France, where the master spent his final years. Francis I commissioned magnificent chateaux like the spectacular Château de Chambord in the Loire Valley, a unique blend of medieval and Renaissance architecture. His court was a center of art and diplomacy, a place of refined culture. Yet, beneath this shimmering surface, new tensions were brewing. The Protestant Reformation was sweeping across Europe, and its ideas were taking root in France, setting the stage for a new and bloody conflict. Not against an external enemy, but one that would tear the French people apart from within. The peace won at such a great cost was about to be shattered once more. As the gentle light of the Renaissance shone upon France, a new and powerful force was sweeping across Europe, the Protestant Reformation. In France, the followers of the French theologian John Calvin, known as the Huguenots, were gaining a significant following, particularly among the nobility and the urban middle class. Their new form of worship, with its emphasis on a direct relationship with God and its rejection of the opulent trappings of the Catholic Church, was seen as a grave threat by the established Catholic majority and the Valois monarchy. What began as a theological debate soon escalated into a political and military crisis. In the mid-16th century, France was plunged into a series of bloody civil conflicts that would tear the nation apart for over 3 decades, a period known as the French Wars of Religion. The kingdom was fractured not just by faith, but by powerful noble factions. On one side stood the staunchly Catholic Guise family, who commanded immense wealth and influence. On the other side were the Protestant Bourbon family, princes of the blood, who stood next in line to the throne should the Valois line fail. The Valois monarchy, caught in the middle, attempted to navigate these treacherous waters, but their efforts were often weak and indecisive. The young king, Charles IX, and his mother, Catherine de' Medici, sought a balance, but the tensions were too great. The nation was a tinderbox, and the smallest spark could ignite a conflagration. That spark came on a warm summer night in August 1572. On the occasion of a royal wedding in Paris, a peace accord was meant to be sealed between the two factions. However, under the cover of darkness, the city's Catholic population, fueled by fear and extremist preachers, turned on the unsuspecting Huguenots who had gathered for the celebration. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was a horrific display of religious hatred. For days, the streets of Paris ran with blood as thousands of men, women, and children were hunted down and slaughtered. The violence spread beyond the capital to the provinces, and the death toll climbed into the tens of thousands. It was a shattering moment, a stark reminder of how fragile a kingdom's peace could be. This event forever poisoned relations and made the prospect of a peaceful settlement seem impossible. The wars descended into a complex and bloody power struggle, culminating in the War of the Three Henrys. The 3 key players were King Henry III, the last of the Valois, Henry of Guise, leader of the Catholic League, and Henry of Navarre, the leader of the Huguenots and the heir to the throne. The conflict was a desperate and brutal struggle for the future of France. In the end, 2 of the Henrys were assassinated, leaving only Henry of Navarre. He was the legitimate heir, but he was a Protestant, and Paris, a fiercely Catholic city, refused to accept him as king. Henry of Navarre was a brilliant soldier and a shrewd politician. He understood that to unite the kingdom, he would have to make a profound sacrifice. In 1593, he converted to Catholicism, famously declaring, "Paris is well worth a mass." With this act, the city gates opened to him, and he was finally crowned King Henry IV, the first of the Bourbon dynasty. His reign was a remarkable period of healing and reconstruction. He brought an end to the long and devastating civil wars with the signing of the Edict of Nantes in 1598. This landmark decree granted the Huguenots the right to worship in certain areas and hold public office. It was not full religious freedom, but it was a groundbreaking act of tolerance that allowed the kingdom to begin to heal. Henry IV was a beloved ruler, a man who worked tirelessly to rebuild his shattered nation. He revitalized the economy, promoted agriculture, and reformed the administration. His most enduring legacy was the promise of peace and prosperity. He famously wished for his people to be so prosperous that every peasant could afford a chicken in his pot every Sunday. He was a king who understood the connection between a strong monarchy and the well-being of his people. His reign, however, was tragically cut short when he was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic in 1610, leaving the throne to his young son, Louis XIII. The early reign of Louis XIII was marked by instability, but order was soon restored by his brilliant and ruthless chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. This is a pivotal moment in the history of the French monarchy. Richelieu's life's work was to centralize all power in the hands of the king, a process that would create the foundation for French absolutism. He systematically humbled the great feudal lords, destroyed their fortified castles, and crushed the remaining political power of the Huguenots. He was a man of iron will who believed in the absolute supremacy of the state, embodied in the king. He did not seek to rule for himself, but to make the king's will the law of the land, paving the way for the most glorious and absolute of French monarchs yet to come. The stage was now set for the sun to rise on a king of unparalleled power, one who would transform the very nature of what it meant to be a monarch. The stage was set by the shrewd and single-minded efforts of Cardinal Richelieu, who had systematically dismantled the power of the great nobles and prepared the way for an unprecedented concentration of royal authority. But it was not Richelieu who would be the beneficiary of this work. It was a young boy who ascended the throne in 1643 at the age of 4, Louis XIV. His early years were marked by a period of chaos and civil war known as the Fronde, a series of rebellions by the aristocracy against the monarchy's growing power. The child king was forced to flee Paris, an experience that would leave an indelible mark on his psyche. This deep-seated fear of rebellion and his profound distrust of the nobility would fuel his lifelong ambition to build a monarchy of unquestionable, absolute power. When Louis XIV took full control of the government in 1661, following the death of his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, he declared his intention to rule alone. He famously proclaimed, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state. This was not just a statement of arrogance, it was a profound declaration of a new political philosophy, the divine right of kings. Louis believed that he was chosen by God to rule and was accountable to no one on earth but God himself. He saw himself not just as a monarch, but as the living embodiment of the French state. He chose the sun as his emblem, earning him the enduring nickname, the Sun King, a celestial body around which all others must revolve. The most magnificent expression of his absolute rule was the creation of the Palace of Versailles. It began as a small hunting lodge, but was transformed by Louis into a sprawling, awe-inspiring complex of buildings, gardens, and fountains. The construction was a monumental undertaking, employing thousands of workers and draining the royal treasury. Versailles was not merely a royal residence, it was a carefully designed instrument of power. Louis compelled the great nobles of France to live at court, keeping them under his watchful eye and away from their provincial power bases. He established a complex system of court rituals and etiquette that made the aristocrats compete for trivial honors, such as helping the king dress in the morning. By making the nobility's lives entirely dependent on his favor, he transformed them from a potential threat into a domesticated and ceremonial elite, a gilded cage of his own design. Life at Versailles was a grand and theatrical spectacle, a world of dazzling balls, intricate operas, and lavish banquets. It was the epicenter of European culture, and all of Europe looked to France for style, art, and intellectual leadership. Louis's reign was a time of immense cultural flourishing. Playwrights like Molière and Racine, painters like Poussin, and composers like Lully were all supported by the Sun King's patronage. He built the Academy of Sciences and the Academy of Architecture, furthering France's reputation as the intellectual heart of the continent. The opulence and grandeur of Versailles were a physical manifestation of the king's glory. Yet, this dazzling facade of absolute power hid growing cracks. Louis XIV's reign was defined by almost constant warfare. He sought to expand France's borders and assert its dominance over Europe, but his numerous conflicts, including the costly War of the Spanish Succession, were a severe drain on the kingdom's finances. He built an immense and powerful army, but the endless campaigns left the nation deeply in debt. In 1685, driven by his desire for religious uniformity, he made a catastrophic decision. He revoked the Edict of Nantes, the decree that had granted religious tolerance to the Huguenots. The persecution that followed led to the flight of over 200,000 of France's most skilled artisans, merchants, and soldiers, a profound economic and intellectual loss for the nation. As the king aged, the splendor of his court began to feel less like a celebration and more like a crushing burden. The extravagant spending and the relentless wars took their toll on the French people, who were burdened by heavy taxes. The king outlived his son and his grandson, and by the time of his death in 1715, he had reigned for 72 years, the longest in European history. He left behind a magnificent but exhausted nation, a kingdom that was the envy of Europe in its glory, but was beginning to show signs of profound internal decay. His absolute power was a double-edged sword. It had united the nation and made it a global power, but it had done so by stifling dissent, crippling the economy, and isolating the monarchy from the realities of its people. The grand architecture of Versailles and the strict etiquette of its court could not hide the fact that the seeds of a new age, an age of reason and revolution, had already been quietly planted. The stage was set for the dramatic and tragic final act of the French monarchy. The long reign of the Sun King had come to a close in 1715, leaving a magnificent but financially exhausted nation. The burden of his ambitious wars and lavish court now fell upon his great-grandson, Louis XIV, a king who came to the throne as a child of 5. For years, the kingdom was governed by a regent, but when Louis XIV came of age, he ruled with a surprising lack of engagement. While he was initially popular, earning the nickname the Beloved, his reign was marked by a quiet but profound decline. Unlike his great-grandfather, who had used his immense power to command and control, Louis XIV was a king of indolence and indecision. He preferred the quiet life of his private apartments to the public spectacle of the court, a retreat that created a vacuum of power and a growing sense of detachment between the monarchy and its subjects. Under Louis XIV, France faced a series of military setbacks. It lost its vast colonial empire in North America to Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, a defeat that was both a military and a psychological blow. The cost of these wars, coupled with the lavish spending of the court, pushed the kingdom into ever-deepening debt. Louis XIV famously, and perhaps apocryphally, uttered the phrase "Après moi le déluge," or "After me, the flood." Whether he actually said it or not, the phrase perfectly captured the sense of foreboding that permeated the late 18th century. It was a time of political paralysis and fiscal irresponsibility. The monarchy, still operating on the principles of absolutism, was no longer able to adapt to the new challenges of a changing world. The flood of which Louis XIV spoke was already gathering force, not in the skies above, but in the minds of the people. This was the age of the Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual movement that championed reason, science, and individual liberty. Thinkers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the monarchy was built. They argued that government should be based on a social contract between rulers and the ruled, not on the divine right of kings. They questioned the very structure of the Ancien Regime, or the Old Regime, a rigid social hierarchy that divided French society into 3 distinct groups, or estates. The first estate was the clergy, who owned a great deal of land and were exempt from paying taxes. The second estate was the nobility, who also enjoyed immense privileges and tax exemptions. The third estate, by far the largest, comprised everyone else, from the wealthiest merchants and doctors to the poorest peasants and urban workers. This vast majority of the population bore the crushing burden of taxation, yet had little to no political power or representation. The inequities of this system were a source of deep and growing resentment. It was a world where privilege was inherited, not earned, and where the most powerful members of society paid the least to support it. The Enlightenment's ideas of equality and justice found fertile ground among the educated members of the Third Estate, who looked at the opulence of Versailles and the poverty of the countryside and saw an unacceptable injustice. In 1774, Louis XVI inherited a kingdom on the brink. He was a kind-hearted and well-meaning man, but he was painfully indecisive and ill-equipped to handle the monumental crisis he faced. He enjoyed a quiet life, with his hobbies of lock-making and hunting, far from the complex political and financial issues of the state. He was married to the young and fashionable Marie Antoinette, an Austrian princess whose extravagant spending and foreign origins made her a target for the public's ire. Her lifestyle, while perhaps not as lavish as painted by her critics, was a symbol of the monarchy's disconnection from the suffering of the common people. The final blow to the monarchy's solvency came from an unexpected source, the American Revolution. Louis VI, seeking revenge against Great Britain for the losses in the 7 Years' War, made the fateful decision to provide immense financial and military support to the American colonists. While the aid helped secure American independence, it bankrupted the French treasury. The debt became a crushing weight, and all efforts to reform the tax system were blocked by the privileged first and second estates, who refused to give up their exemptions. The monarchy was trapped. It had no money, no support from its people, and no answers to the profound questions of a new age. The king, a well-meaning man in a hopeless situation, was about to face the reckoning of 1,000 years of accumulated power and privilege. The old world was about to come crashing down. The year is 1789. The Kingdom of France, burdened by immense debt and a system of profound inequality, stood at the precipice. For centuries, the will of the monarch had been law, but now the ground beneath the throne was shifting. The final and most fateful act of the monarchy's long history was about to begin. Facing a total financial collapse, Louis XVI, with great reluctance, was forced to take an extraordinary step. He convened the Estates General, a representative assembly of the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, that had not met in over 175 years. The king's intention was to gain support for new taxes, but he inadvertently opened a floodgate of discontent. The representatives of the Third Estate, who represented 98% of the population, demanded a fundamental restructuring of the political system. When the king and the privileged estates resisted their demands, the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, vowing not to disband until they had written a new constitution. The news of these events spread to Paris, where a long, hot summer of tension finally boiled over. On July 14th, a crowd seeking weapons and gunpowder stormed the medieval fortress of the Bastille, a symbol of royal tyranny. Though the prison held only a handful of inmates, its capture was a powerful and symbolic victory for the people. This was a point of no return. The king's authority was now openly challenged not just by politicians, but by the will of the people in the streets. From this moment on, the revolution, once an abstract idea, was a tangible force of change. In the wake of this revolt, the National Assembly, now with the support of the king, began to dismantle the ancient regime. In a single dramatic night in August, they abolished feudalism, stripping the nobility and the clergy of their ancient privileges and tax exemptions. A few weeks later, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a landmark document that proclaimed that all men were born free and equal in rights, and that sovereignty belonged to the nation, not the king. These were not just reforms. They were revolutionary statements that directly contradicted the 1,000-year-old principle of divine right. The royal family, once sheltered in the immense luxury and isolation of the Palace of Versailles, found their world shrinking. In October, a mob of Parisian women, furious over the high price of bread, marched the 12 miles to Versailles and stormed the palace. They demanded that the king and queen come to Paris to be among their people. The royal family, under duress, was forced to leave the gilded halls of Versailles forever and relocate to the Tuileries Palace in the heart of the capital. They were no longer the distant, absolute rulers of France. They were now, in effect, prisoners of the revolution. As the revolution grew more radical, the position of the monarchy became untenable. Louis XVI, still hoping to reclaim his former authority, made a fateful miscalculation. In June 1791, he and his family attempted to flee Paris and join counter-revolutionary forces. Their flight was discovered, and they were captured at the town of Varennes and brought back to Paris. This act, seen as a betrayal by the French people, sealed the monarchy's fate. The king was now viewed not as a misguided ruler, but as a traitor to the nation. The revolution's momentum was unstoppable. In 1792, in the wake of war with Austria and Prussia, the monarchy was formally abolished and the First French Republic was declared. Louis XVI was no longer the King of France, but simply Citizen Louis Capet. He and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were put on trial for treason against the nation. The trial was a foregone conclusion. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine. He faced his death with quiet dignity, reportedly forgiving his enemies just before the blade fell. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette followed him to the same fate. With the fall of the blade, the 1,000-year-old history of the French monarchy, from Clovis to the last Bourbon king, was brought to a dramatic and bloody close. An entire era of French history was swept away in a single moment. The principle of the divine right of kings was replaced by the will of the people, and a republic, a new form of government forged in the fires of revolution, was born. The old world was gone, replaced by a new and uncertain future. But the legacy of the kings, for good and for ill, would continue to echo through the centuries, a reminder of the deep and complex tapestry of French history. The story, however, is not quite over. After the storm of the Revolution, the monarchy would make a brief and fragile return. With the fall of the guillotine, the thousand-year-old story of the French monarchy had seemingly reached its brutal and definitive conclusion. The divine right of kings had been replaced by the radical and powerful idea of a republic. But the history of France, like the currents of a great river, does not follow a straight or simple path. The Revolution's promise of liberty and equality descended into the violent chaos of the Reign of Terror, and the nascent republic soon found itself at war with all of Europe. From this maelstrom of conflict and political instability, a new and formidable figure emerged. A man who, though not a king, would rule with more power than any monarch before him, Napoleon Bonaparte. He crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, creating a new short-lived empire that, in its grandeur and centralization of power, echoed the absolutism of Louis XIV. Napoleon's reign demonstrated that while the institution of the monarchy had been abolished, the deep-seated French desire for a strong, singular head of state remained a powerful force. Following Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the victorious European powers sought to restore the old order. In an effort to stabilize France and contain the revolutionary spirit, they brought back the Bourbons in what is known as the Bourbon Restoration. The new king was Louis XIII, the younger brother of the executed Louis XVI. He was a pragmatic man who understood that a full return to the Ancien Regime was impossible. He granted a constitutional charter that preserved many of the revolutionary freedoms and established a bicameral legislature. The monarchy was no longer absolute. It was now a constitutional one. This was a fragile compromise between the traditions of the old world and the realities of the new. The king and his court attempted to find a place for themselves in a society that had moved on. But the past, with its memories of revolution and empire, was never far away. Louis XIII's reign was a delicate balance, but his brother and successor, Charles X, was an unyielding conservative. Charles believed in the divine right of kings, the conviction that was out of step with his time. He was determined to restore the power and privileges of the nobility and the church. His attempts to do so, through a series of increasingly reactionary laws, ignited another revolution. In July 1830, the people of Paris rose up in protest, and Charles X was forced to abdicate. This was the end of the senior Bourbon line's rule in France. In their place, the July Revolution brought a new kind of monarch to the throne, Louis Philippe I, from the more liberal cadet branch of the House of Orleans. He was known as the Citizen King, and he presented himself not as a divine ruler, but as a man of the people. He adopted the tricolor flag of the Revolution and lived a simpler, less ostentatious life than his predecessors. His reign was a period of industrial growth and bourgeois prosperity, but it failed to address the deep-seated grievances of the working class and the rising democratic movement. Like those before him, his authority was not enough to contain the powerful forces of change. In 1848, another wave of revolution, a springtime of nations that swept across Europe, toppled his monarchy, and France was again declared a republic. The monarchy would make one final, brief, and strange appearance. After the chaos of the 1848 revolution, the French people, seeking order and stability, once again turned to the name of Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the great emperor, was elected president, and then, in 1852, declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, establishing the Second French Empire. His reign was a blend of authoritarian rule and economic modernization. He beautified Paris and built new infrastructure, but his foreign policy was often misguided. His empire ended abruptly and ingloriously in 1870, with a crushing defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, and from its ashes the Third French Republic was born. And so, the era of kings and emperors in France finally came to an end. But the story of the monarchy is more than just a list of rulers and their reigns. Its legacy is woven into the very fabric of the nation. It was the monarchy that, over 1,000 years, transformed a patchwork of warring territories into a unified kingdom. It was the kings who gave France its borders, its language, and its identity. The great monuments that still stand today, the cathedrals, the castles of the Loire Valley, and above all, the breathtaking Palace of Versailles, are not just historical relics. They are testaments to a time when the power of the monarchy was used to create magnificent and enduring works of art and architecture. The Louvre Museum, once a medieval fortress and then a royal palace, is now a repository for the nation's treasures, a symbol of the king's vast patronage, which is now open for all to see. The legacy is also one of ideas. The French monarchy, with its insistence on divine right, inadvertently provoked a powerful and revolutionary counter-reaction. The very principles that define modern France, liberty, equality, and fraternity, were forged in the struggle against the old regime. The French Republic, a product of this struggle, is a direct descendant of the monarchy it overthrew, inheriting its centralized bureaucracy and its sense of national mission. The story of the French monarchy is not a simple tale of rise and fall. It is a complex and nuanced narrative of a civilization slowly defining itself, a grand and winding journey from a long-haired tribal chief to a humble, well-meaning king on a scaffold. It is a story that has now concluded, but whose echoes can still be heard in the quiet corners of castles and cathedrals, and in the heart of a nation shaped by its kings and its revolutions. Our long journey through the centuries has come to a peaceful close. The castles are still, the crowns are quiet, and the voices of history are now a distant whisper. You can rest now, with the knowledge that this vast and beautiful story has been fully told.